The streets of Chicago always carried that frantic rhythm, almost like an offbeat orchestra. Car horns blaring, hurried footsteps, voices blending into a tangled rush. Rosalie Gibbs walked out of the hospital with tense shoulders, holding a folder of documents tight against her chest, as if it were her shield against the world. She had no time for distractions, but fate rarely asks permission to make itself known. And then it happened. A solid figure crossed her path in a split second of carelessness. Papers slipped from her hands, spinning like autumn leaves in the wind. The collision was quick, almost unnoticeable to those passing by, yet enough to leave a mark. Rosalie, wide-eyed, looked up and met a gaze that seemed to hold more silence than words. Hayden Pratt. She didn't know who he was, not yet, but she felt that moment carried a strange weight, as if something had begun without warning. He immediately bent down, picking up one of the pages before the wind could take it away. The gesture was simple, almost automatic, but there was something deliberate in the steadiness of his hands. Embarrassed, Rosalie whispered a soft "thank you," too quiet, as if afraid to be heard. Hayden didn't respond with words, he only returned her gaze, lingering for just a fraction longer than it should have, filled with something impossible to explain. Passion? No, not yet. It was more like a shy spark hiding behind the mystery. Rosalie quickly gathered the papers and kept walking, her heart beating faster than she wanted to admit. Maybe it was just the shock, she told herself, trying to believe there was nothing special about it. But her practical mind couldn't ignore one detail. His eyes were still on her as she turned the corner, and that look had left invisible marks, as if it had carved her name, without ever speaking a word. Hayden, on the other hand, stood still for a few seconds after the encounter. It wasn't common for anything or anyone to break through his rigid, carefully calculated routine. Yet that young stranger had done it, without trying, simply by existing in the wrong place at the exact right time. He drew in a deep breath, adjusted his suit with a discreet motion, and resumed his pace as if nothing had happened. But inside him, the memory of that troubled expression had already begun to take up an uncomfortable space. And so, in the middle of the city's noise, two worlds continued on parallel paths, unaware that they were about to be pulled back toward each other once again. After all, chance is never as innocent as it seems. The hospital always carried that smell of disinfectant mixed with the exhaustion of endless hours. Rosalie walked down the hallway, holding patient files as if she were carrying responsibilities too heavy for her arms. It was just another ordinary day, until it wasn't. When she lifted her eyes, there he was, Hayden Pratt, standing there as if the place belonged to him, imposing yet discreet, wearing a suit that stood out completely against the rushed indifference of the corridors. She stopped walking, almost stumbling over her own step. It made no sense for that man to be there. For a moment, Rosalie thought she was imagining things. But no, it was real. He had come, and in his eyes was the same mysterious calm she had seen during their chance meeting on the street. Her heart tightened, beating to the rhythm of a hidden drum. What did he want? Hayden approached without hurry, as if measuring every move. In his hands he carried a simple envelope. He handed it to her with a restrained, almost imperceptible smile. Inside were the documents she had lost the day they collided. Rosalie was speechless, her lips slightly parted as she tried to organize her thoughts and emotions. He hadn't just kept the papers, he had taken the trouble to return them in person. Who would do that? Before she could properly thank him, Hayden broke the silence. His voice was deep, low, but clear, as if every word had been weighed before being spoken. "I thought you'd prefer to have them back in person." Rosalie swallowed hard, her face flushing. There was something in the way he looked at her that seemed to cut through her defenses, stripping them away. Then, without hesitation, came the invitation. A meeting, not a hesitant request, but more like someone outlining an inevitable destiny. Rosalie blinked quickly, overwhelmed. Her first instinct was to refuse, because all of it felt far too strange. But her heart didn't follow reason. Her chest warmed, a sudden flame that left her breathless. He didn't insist, he simply let the invitation linger in the air, like an unfinished melody. An invitation that didn't need justification, only the courage to accept. When Hayden walked away, leaving her frozen in the middle of the hallway, Rosalie felt that something had shifted. It wasn't just about returning documents, it was about opening a door to the unknown. And the unknown in that moment had intense eyes and a mystery that pulled her closer, even when reason was screaming for her to run. The restaurant looked like something out of a European postcard. Crystal chandeliers reflected the soft glow of light, while waiters moved gracefully between tables as if part of a silent choreography. Sitting across from Hayden, Rosalie felt out of place, like a puzzle piece that didn't quite fit the picture. The simple dress she had chosen seemed even plainer under the glow of such sophistication. And yet, there was something in the way Hayden looked at her that made her believe she belonged there, even if her heart wavered between wonder and insecurity. He spoke little. The silences were long, heavy, yet not uncomfortable. There was a restrained passion in his eyes, as if every pause revealed more than words ever could. Rosalie, in turn, filled those moments with timid smiles, fidgeting with her silverware as if searching for balance. With every gesture, she felt she was sitting in front of someone who carried an entire world within him, but rarely allowed anyone to cross into it. The wine arrived, painting their glasses a shade of ruby. Rosalie touched her glass carefully, as if the simple act might expose her. She wasn't used to this world. She knew the bitter coffee at the hospital, the smell of freshly washed uniforms, and the rush of crowded buses. Hayden, on the other hand, seemed made for this setting. Every movement, every softly spoken word breathed elegance. The contrast was so striking she couldn't help but wonder, what did he see in her? And yet, tenderness revealed itself in the smallest things, in the way he pulled out her chair discreetly, in the way he leaned forward to listen, as if her story mattered just as much as any business meeting. That attention awakened a flame inside her she hadn't felt in a long time, the feeling of being truly seen. Not for her looks, not for her status, but for who she was at her core. Even so, the weight of their differences pressed down. Rosalie noticed the glances around them, curious, judgmental, as if trying to decipher why someone so simple sat across from a man like Hayden Pratt. She pretended not to care, but inside, the doubt throbbed. It wasn't just the luxury that intimidated her, it was the fear of not being enough. Hayden, however, seemed to see nothing but her. The world around them could have been made of crystal and gold, yet his eyes remained fixed only on Rosalie. It was as if for a few fleeting moments, luxury lost its meaning and gave way to something purer, something more intense. A romance was being born there, quietly, between glasses of wine and lingering glances that defied reason. But every beginning also carries the shadow of a threat. In the dim light of Hayden's apartment, lit only by the glow of the city streaming through the windows, Rosalie saw a side of him she had never seen before. Here, without the sparkle of restaurants or the formality of discreet meetings, there was silence. Not the comfortable silence they shared over dinners, but a heavy, dense silence, as if every object around them was keeping a secret. It was an atmosphere that almost demanded caution, as if even a word could break it. Hayden was different. His gaze, usually steady, seemed lost in some distant place, as if he were speaking to memories only he could see. Rosalie approached him, hesitant, and it was then that he spoke, for the first time, about the wife he had lost. His words came slowly, as if they had to cross a desert before reaching her. He didn't say her name right away, just she. And even then, the pain was clear. Rosalie felt her chest tighten. It wasn't just compassion, it was something deeper, the sense that she was standing before a man still caught between the present and the past. Every gesture of his carried a hidden tenderness, but also an invisible barrier. There was affection, there was desire, but there was also an unshakable barrier, the shadow of the woman who was no longer there, yet still filled every corner of his heart. He showed her a photograph, tucked inside a modest frame on the shelf. He didn't need to explain. The image spoke for itself. Rosalie swallowed hard, trying to keep her composure. It wasn't exactly jealousy, but the fear that she might never cross that bridge. How do you compete with a memory? How do you find a place beside someone who is gone, but still lives on in every silence? Hayden, however, didn't seem to be asking for pity. In his words was a painful honesty, as if he wanted to push her away before she dared to get too close. It was almost a warning, this is who I am, and this is the weight I carry. But Rosalie didn't step back. Her eyes held tenderness, and though her heart trembled, she stayed, because something inside her whispered that running away would hurt more than staying. The air between them grew heavier, as if his confession had changed the gravity of the room. Rosalie wanted to reach for his hand, to tell him he wasn't alone in this journey, but something held her back. Maybe it was respect for his grief, maybe it was fear of surrendering too much. And then the silence returned, deeper this time, marking the beginning of a new stage between them. A stage where romance and passion would have to face the ghost of absence. Maggie was the first to notice the change in Rosalie's expression. A sharp-eyed friend with an easy laugh and a quick tongue, she didn't need many clues to figure out there was someone new. At the small cafe where they met after work, Rosalie tried to change the subject, but Maggie pressed on. "You're different. Your eyes, they look like they're hiding a secret." Rosalie smiled shyly without admitting anything. Still, Maggie already had a feeling. That secret had a name, and it probably came with risks. At the hospital, whispers began to spread. Colleagues noticed the spark in her eyes, the sudden distractions, the way she seemed to be waiting for something in the middle of the daily rush. For most, it was nothing more than passing gossip. For Rosalie, it was an invisible weight. She didn't want anyone to know, not yet. After all, how could she explain that a millionaire CEO was seeking her out? With every curious glance, her heart tightened, as if she had to justify something she didn't even fully understand herself. Her father, Thomas Gibbs, was more direct. One night, when he saw her coming home later than usual, he asked with the firmness of someone who worried, but also suspected. Rosalie tried to avoid the conversation, but his unease wouldn't let it go. Men like that, they don't look at girls like you without wanting something in return. His words hurt, not because of their sharpness, but because they reminded her that to her father, the world was still divided between those with power and those who merely survived. Rosalie wanted to believe Hayden was different, but her father's doubt lingered like an echo. On the other side, Hayden Pratt was watching too. Hayden's mother, elegant and reserved, didn't openly voice her concerns, but every evaluating glance, every pause in her words when Rosalie's name came up, said enough. For Catherine, it wasn't about disdain, but caution. She knew how deep her son's wounds were, and doubted whether someone as simple as Rosalie would have the strength to carry them. Torn between protection and skepticism, her presence became a quiet yet constant shadow. Even Jake Sherman, Hayden's right-hand man, questioned things silently. He never dared to interfere, but he saw his boss drawing close to a woman far outside the expected circle. For a man used to strategies and calculations, this step felt irrational, almost dangerous. He never said a word, but his pragmatic look left no doubt. Jake believed Hayden was taking too big a risk. Caught in the middle of all these eyes, Rosalie felt the weight grow heavier. Between a love just beginning to blossom and the pressure closing in from every side, she was discovering a new battle. To believe in something no one else seemed to believe in. The romance, so fragile, was already being tested, not only by Hayden's past, but by the silent judgment surrounding them like an invisible wall. The night was cold in Chicago, and from the terrace of Hayden's building, the city lights seemed even farther away than the sky itself. Rosalie gazed at the glowing horizon, a knot tightening in her chest. It wasn't just his silence that night, but the way every word seemed to vanish before it was spoken. When she finally found the courage to speak, her voice came out soft, heavy with hesitation. "Sometimes I feel like I'm not really here. Like when you look at me, you see someone else." Hayden drew in a long breath and looked away. That simple act, avoiding her eyes, cut like a blade. There was no immediate answer, only silence, a silence that screamed louder than any words. Rosalie's hands grew damp, her heart raced. The last thing she wanted was to be a shadow in someone's life, much less a substitute for someone who was gone. Yet standing there, that was exactly how she felt. "That's not it," he finally murmured, his voice rough, almost impatient. Rosalie took a step back, stung by the tone. If that wasn't it, then why did the emptiness between them keep growing? Why did every gesture of affection feel tainted by an invisible shadow? His distant stare only reinforced the fear that she was fighting a ghost she could never defeat. The tension escalated. Driven by love tangled with desperation, Rosalie confessed her fear of never being enough. Hayden, in turn, lashed back, insisting she couldn't possibly understand what it meant to lose someone you loved with your whole soul. The passion that once brought them together now flared into a reckless fire, burning in the clash of words that could never be taken back. In the end, silence returned, but it was no longer the same. There was no tenderness in it, no sense of closeness, only distance. Hayden shut down like a fortress, walls rising higher than Rosalie knew she had the strength to climb. With tears brimming in her eyes, she realized she might have crossed an invisible line. Maybe he wasn't ready yet. Maybe he never would be. That night, the romance that once felt so alive bore its first deep fracture. It wasn't a declared ending, but an abyss opening wide between them, large enough to swallow everything they had been building. Rosalie left with her heart in pieces, while Hayden stayed behind on the terrace, a prisoner of the silence that once again pulled him away from life. The first abyss had been drawn, and no one knew if there was a bridge strong enough to cross it. Rosalie walked through the streets of Chicago with heavy, dragging steps, as if each block weighed a ton. The cold wind hit her face, but the pain came from within. After their last argument, she realized she couldn't keep going as if nothing had happened. Her heart was torn between the desire to stay by Hayden's side and the instinct to protect her own soul before it was too late. Running away felt like cowardice, but staying felt like diving without a safety net. That night, lying in her bed, she stared at the ceiling for hours, replaying every look, every silence from him. Memories came in waves, sometimes gentle, sometimes merciless. The affection she felt was real, but insecurity grew like a shadow. Rosalie knew love could heal, but it could also imprison. And the fear of losing herself to someone still trapped in the past began to suffocate her. Meanwhile, Hayden sank further into his own isolation. Locked in his elegant apartment, He wandered through the rooms like a ghost. He tried to convince himself that Rosalie deserved someone better, someone without chains on their heart. But her absence weighed unbearably on him. The silence that had always been his refuge now felt like a cruel sentence. Without her, the walls echoed colder and the emptiness became unbearable. Rosalie began avoiding messages, meetings, any bridge that could keep them connected. Each time her phone vibrated, her chest raced, but she resisted, believing she needed to protect herself. Maggie, noticing her friend's pain, tried to comfort her. Sometimes, loving someone also means knowing when to stop. The words were harsh, but they rang like a warning. Rosalie didn't want to give up, but she also didn't know if she had the strength to keep going. On the other side, Hayden was fighting his own battle. He remembered her touch, the way Rosalie's eyes looked at him without judgment. He remembered her shy laugh, the quiet courage with which she had approached him despite their differences. And every memory hit him like a blow. No matter how much he tried to convince himself that keeping her away was the right thing to do, the pain of her absence was stronger than any reasoning. Two hearts, each on their own side, trying to run away while silently begging to stay. The silence between them wasn't just distance, it was an unspoken battle. And what neither of them knew was that this silence was about to be broken by something much bigger, something capable of turning everything upside down. The phone rang late at night, and Rosalie, already used to the silence of the past few weeks, hesitated before answering. On the other end, Hayden's voice sounded different, lower, heavier, as if it carried centuries in just a few words. He asked to meet her. There was no pleading, but there was also no firmness, just a curt request, almost a summons. Against the instinct that told her to refuse, Rosalie went. Her heart knew something was about to change. They met in an almost empty park, lit only by yellow streetlights and the distant reflection of the city. Hayden looked more worn down than ever. His eyes, always intense, were now deep shadows. "I need to tell you something," he began, his voice faltering on the first try. Rosalie took a deep breath, feeling that every word to come could either shatter everything or rebuild it from scratch. The revelation struck like lightning. The accident that took his wife's life wasn't just a cruel twist of fate, as everyone believed. Hayden carried the weight of guilt from a choice he had made. On that fateful night, he had argued with her, insisted she come pick him up, even knowing she was tired. Hours later, he received the news of the accident. The pain wasn't only from the loss, it came from the certainty that in some way he had been the trigger. Rosalie felt the ground vanish beneath her feet. The guilt Hayden had carried in silence, shaping his actions and his distance, was now laid bare like an open wound. She didn't know what to say. Her heart filled with compassion, but also fear. That secret explained everything: the silence, the distant looks, the barrier between them. But it also raised another question. Could she love someone who couldn't forgive himself? Head bowed, Hayden seemed ready to see her leave. He wasn't seeking absolution, he just needed the truth to be spoken. It was as if confessing was the only way to survive, even if it meant losing Rosalie. His vulnerability touched her deeper than any gesture of affection. For the first time, she saw the man behind the armor, the shattered human being he hid beneath layers of power and control. The wind cut through their skin, but the coldest part was between them, in the space of uncertainty that had opened. Rosalie, silent tears streaming down her face, took a step toward him. She said nothing. She simply stood there, close enough for him to feel her presence, yet far enough that the choice was still his. The weight of the revelation hung between them like an unfinished sentence. The future was still a mystery, but one thing was clear: nothing would ever be the same. The following days were different. Rosalie didn't disappear, as Hayden had feared. On the contrary, she began appearing in small gestures: a short message, a cup of coffee left on the table, a quiet presence that said more than any speech could. It wasn't immediate forgiveness, it wasn't forgetting, it was patience. And for Hayden, that simple act of staying was like hearing a new sound after so long in silence. He began to talk more. Slowly, between pauses and hesitations, he shared memories, guilt, regrets. Rosalie listened quietly, sometimes touching his hand, sometimes just looking at him with tenderness. She didn't try to erase the pain, knowing it would be impossible. She simply offered space for him to breathe within her. The romance, which had seemed on the verge of dissolving, was reborn in their mutual surrender, more mature, more aware. One evening, walking along the Michigan Lake shoreline, Hayden stopped suddenly. The wind fluttered his coat. His eyes were misty but steady. "I can't change what happened, but I want to learn to live without running from it. I want to live with you." The confession wasn't grand nor full of unrealistic promises, but it was the first time Rosalie heard not just desire in him, but hope. She smiled shyly, and in that gesture, there was something greater than words. The fear didn't vanish. Social differences still lingered, and the eyes of distrust still followed them. But in that moment, none of that mattered. What mattered was the choice to stay, to love despite the weight. The spark between them was no longer fragile. It was strong enough to face the wind. Rosalie's reunion with her father reflected this change. Thomas, still cautious, watched his daughter speak of Hayden with serene conviction, as someone who doesn't seek approval but shares her path. He didn't say he trusted her, but he didn't stop her either. Perhaps because he saw in her eyes something impossible to deny: courage. And courage, after all, has always been another name for love. On the last night before leaving for work, Hayden took Rosalie to the terrace of his building. The city glittered below, but for the first time, the silence between them wasn't absence, it was companionship. Rosalie rested her head on his shoulder, and Hayden closed his eyes, taking a deep breath. There were no guarantees, no certainties, but there was the sound of a new beginning beating inside them like a silent promise that between pain and hope, there is always room for love to be reborn. Rosalie discovered that even in the darkest moments, love has the power to reignite the flame of hope. Hayden learned that it's not about forgetting the past, but about finding the strength to move forward alongside the one who reaches out their hand. This journey showed that when two hearts decide to surrender, even the weight of silence can turn into a melody of new beginnings. Stories like this remind us that life always gives us another chance to believe in love. That pain is not the end, but often the beginning of a new chapter. Just as Rosalie and Hayden chose not to run from their feelings, each of us can also embrace the courage to love, even when everything seems lost. If this story touched you, leave a comment saying, "Love changes lives." Subscribe to Eternal Romance Stories and experience with every episode emotions that warm the soul and reflections that transform the heart. Here, every story is a reminder that love is the most powerful force in existence, capable of changing destinies and lighting the way. And this was just one of the many stories that will continue to move you here.